Yeah. Welcome to the show, everyone. It is the 9th of November, 2020, and I am your host, Byron Pace. I was going to be bringing you a show all about the legal and illegal trade of wildlife around the world, speaking to the head of communications of an organization called Traffic. But you're going to have to wait 2 weeks for that. It is still coming. But I postponed it because a friend of mine put up a really fascinating post just a couple of days ago about this giant iceberg that was sailing its way towards South Georgia with potentially quite devastating effects on the island's inhabitants. There are some positives as well, and we're going to get into that. But I thought that this is something that's happening right now, so I wanted to cover it on the show. And it's something that you can go and interact with in a way and have a look at some of the satellite imagery. And I'm going to provide the links for that in the show notes. So anything that we talk about, if you want to dig into a little bit more, you can go and actually have a look and see what this giant iceberg is all about and what its current path is. So just for a little bit of background, but we do dig into this. This carved a couple of years ago from the Antarctic ice shelf, or one of the Antarctic ice shelves. At the time when it carved, it was approximately 1 trillion tons. Now, we give some comparisons of size within the show, but mainly comparing it to the South Georgia, the island itself. But a lot of you have probably never been there, so maybe don't have an idea of how big that island even is. So if you are in the States, this is maybe a good visualization. It's about the area of Delaware. And if you're in Europe, get 2 times Luxemburg in terms of size, and you will be pretty close to the area that this iceberg is covering. So I'm speaking with Sarah Roberts, who has been on the show before. She was the one that brought this to my attention. She is a TV presenter. She is a children's author. She is a science communicator, and I love having her on the show. So any excuse, here she is telling us all about this giant iceberg, A68. Sarah, welcome back to the show. You were on just only a couple of weeks ago, but it was the long-form chat. We found out a bit about your life. We talked about all manner of things, lots of ocean things, the sharks, basalt. But today, you're coming on to talk on the science shorts element of the show about an iceberg, about a very, very big iceberg and what's happening with it, and potentially the implications for wildlife way down south near South Georgia. Tell me a little bit about it. Now, this is you brought it to my attention through Instagram, through your outreach and science communication through Instagram. I was like, this looks like a really interesting story. Let me give you a call.
Yeah, good old social media. It's great for great for spreading the science communication messages. Yeah. So basically, the iceberg is A68, and it is the largest iceberg ever recorded to break off Larsen's Shelf, which it didn't actually happen recently. It happened in 2017, but it was stuck in a bunch of sea ice near Antarctica where it broke away. But recently, it has basically entered into Iceberg Alley, where it's traveling along now at speed, and there's a potential that it may hit the island of South Georgia, which is a big deal because this iceberg is actually pretty much the same size as the island. So to give you some perspective, yeah, it's about the size of Somerset, and it's really weird because its dimensions. I think scientists actually thought it would have broken down a bit more by now, but it's actually like the same dimensions of a credit card. It's only 200 meters thick, but obviously absolutely huge, which is going to have massive implications for the wildlife if it does hit the island.
Okay, because we're used to thinking about icebergs with these really deep keels.
Mm.
We see this tiny little piece on top, and then this, I can't even remember what the proportions I know. Was it 90, 10%, 90% below? I can't remember. What normally is the proportions of an iceberg, which would mean that, I mean, South Georgia's pretty used to icebergs traveling towards it, but these icebergs historically have been caught or drifted away far offshore. That's the difference here, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so basically, there's a few factors at play here. I mean, the the size of the iceberg, as I said, is absolutely huge. It's basically like the size of the island again. And right now, it is a critical time for wildlife there, especially like the predator species, like the penguins and the seal species on the island. And when they're feeding their young, just to sort of put it into perspective, they're obviously leaving their chicks as a penguin in a vulnerable position when they go off at sea to find food. But this could mean if the iceberg hits in the way that it's been predicted that it might, it would sort of swing round the bottom end of the island and then actually hit on the west side, which is where all the wildlife is. And that could block their route out to sea to go and find fish and to find food for their young, and that would sort of, I mean, I have no idea how much longer that would add on to their journey, but it would have a significant effect on the survivability of their young, I should imagine.
I vaguely remember reading something, and I really wish I'd written it down, about an iceberg, not these proportions, but an iceberg that had also sort of run aground and had impacted populations of penguins negatively, and a number had died in the last couple of decades.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a few. So this island, like you say, it's not new. It's not new territory having icebergs land in the area. It's known as an iceberg graveyard, and that is just basically the direction. There's usually like a strong southwesterly wind there, and the area that it's in from Antarctica, it does tend to get quite a few different flows of icebergs. But I mean, that island, South Georgia, it's home to king penguins. It's got the macaroni penguins.
They are too
It's
cool,
got
the
a huge
macaroni penguin.
amount of yeah. I mean, it's got other species too, and like a huge amount of elephant seals and fur seals. I think it's got like 95% of the world's population of fur seals that visit there each year for breeding season. So it's quite an important area in terms of biodiversity. So yeah, I mean, and this is all perspective. It may not hit there, and like we were saying, I mean, I think me and you were discussing earlier that there are actually pros to the iceberg being out in open ocean. So it's
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
all it's all in the balance right now.
Yeah, most of the, in fact, I think all of the media reports that I saw, which was like BBC, CNN. I mean, they weren't really that in depth. None of them mentioned any of the positives at all.
Yeah, it is always kind of doom and gloom and really scary, isn't it? But there is, like I say, quite a lot of unknowns right now. But the main thing, like there's been a few studies. British Antarctic Survey have done a few studies. The main one really is the impact on krill. So an iceberg at sea, because the icebergs over time they accumulate dust. And this is to do with how an iceberg forms, I guess, because essentially they're formed like through the glaciers. They're glacier fed, and they create a sheet of ice, and then when the ice breaks down from that sheet, it forms an iceberg. And because they carry those layers of dust and nutrients, when they melt in open ocean, they release those layers, and that actually can feed the krill and create like a real nice krill population around the icebergs in the ocean. And the benefit there is the krill are great at carbon fixing. So they eat all of this dust, this nutrients, and then they essentially poo it out, and that sinks down to the lower levels of the food chain and right down to the seabed too. To the point where there's actually a science study that started last year where scientists are actually able to sample that different dust from previous ice melts on the seabed, and they can actually use that to sort of look at other huge melts that have happened in the past. So we're talking like huge melts that could have happened like 120,000 years ago, or 3 million years ago, just to see how climate has changed in that time, and what we might be looking to in the future. So there's some really cool and interesting things that you can learn from these icebergs too.
That's really fascinating. One of the just going back to the negative aspects. One of the things we didn't touch on, but I know that you'd mentioned it to me, was this scouring effect of the seabed, with it being such a shallow iceberg. And the way I was kind of imagining it is, we talk about the damage that trawlers do to the seabed, or like from repetitive trawling and scraping of the seabed. I mean, I suppose this iceberg not only would sit over a lot of seabed if it does run aground, but could drift a long way and scour as it goes until it stops.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, it would probably kill everything on the sea bottom as it does that, and then of course, like the shade that it would create in the areas where it's not touching the seabed is going to have a huge knock on effect on things like phytoplankton. So anything that photosynthesizes, anything that relies on light, yeah, it's going to have a pretty doom and gloom affect it if that happens. Yes, but I mean, the thing is that iceberg could sit there. Scientists reckon for like up to 10 years as it breaks down. So it would be quite a devastating long-term effect, especially for the predator species which rely on that sheltered west side of the island to have their chicks and to be able to pup in terms of seal populations too.
There was some research tied to whales and increased numbers of whales off South Georgia.
There's been some really nice, really great studies and really nice positive things in terms of wildlife from South Georgia. There was a lovely study that came out on the 5th of November, and that one was just saying about the return of the humpbacks. So obviously there was commercial whaling that took place for a long, long time. Until it pretty much decimated whale populations around South Georgia. But now they're seeing like large numbers of humpback groups returning since 2013, and they're still growing in numbers. We're also seeing southern right whales coming into the area in the last 20 years, and also fin whales and blue whales. So, I mean,
Wow.
if the iceberg stays out at sea, that could be a great thing because all that krill is going to be great food for the schooling fish, which then, and also the whale species that are traveling through there. So, it's sort of like 50-50 here right now. It could
Mm.
be a great thing. Yeah, I mean, I guess some of the other worries in terms of a free flowing iceberg, especially one this big, is it might hit an oil rig.
Oh yeah.
um, you've got oil
Or a
rigs, you've
ship.
got
we
yeah,
know about
yeah,
ships and
you know what
icebergs.
happened with Titanic, yeah, and that is a very real issue, and of course, like submerged pipes under the sea surface, because they do drag along the bottom. So it's not necessarily just the worry on wildlife. I'm sure that there's quite a few people twitching right now. Anybody with sort of an investment in that particular area. Um, but I think we were briefly talking as well, like because the future technology, of course. I mean, the bigger picture of this iceberg has broken off from a place called Larsen Shelf. Now, Larsen Shelf is an area of sea ice that stretches off at the top of Antarctica, and it's really good at slowing down the movement of other icebergs into Iceberg Alley and into the ocean, where they melt and it increases sea level. This huge iceberg that's broken off there will have an effect on the integrity of Larsen's shelf, which we know has sort of been fracturing over the years anyway. And but the bigger thing is that ice shelf is as I said, it's glacier fed, and every time these icebergs break off it means that the glaciers that almost like rivers, if you can imagine streams running into a river like tributaries, it's kind of the same but a real slowed down version with glaciers. They flow into this ice shelf, and every time you remove icebergs from there it means that they can flow faster, and also they're thinner, which has a huge effect when it comes to the sea level rise and the amount of ice that's actually reaching the ocean.
So it's actually might perpetuate more carving, could
Yeah,
it? Or
yeah,
more
it
icebergs floating
probably
away.
will. It's from everything I've read, it sounds like that is a very real possibility. So it's hard to really say what's going to happen, but it's a really interesting time in our lives because there's so much satellite technology, and the scientists are able to get so much more information now on this particular glacial melt. But also, as I said, like using the dust from the past, they can actually really take a glimpse into the history and sort of compare carbon levels of the past, maybe even project what we might be looking at in the next couple of 100 years in terms of our you know carbon levels and temperatures and sea level rise and all sorts of really interesting information there. um,
Yeah, it's a fascinating case study, this, because I think we're all very well aware with global climate change and our warming climate that this kind of event is going to happen with greater frequency. There will be another iceberg of equal proportions or bigger coming in the future, because we are losing ice around the world, north and south, at a very rapid rate. So trying to understand how this interacts in the ecosystems that it passes through is really important.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also quite interesting because as humans, one of our key skills has always been to adapt, right? So, you know, we almost can foresee that there's going to be some scary negative consequences, especially when it comes to climate change and global warming. And there's already scientists and people, forward thinking people out there, sort of thinking, well, okay, if this is happening, how can we try and use this almost to our advantage? So one of the really interesting things that I was looking at is the concept of being able to utilize these icebergs. So rather than just letting them sit there and melt, is it possible actually to try and transport that fresh water essentially and use it to use as drinking water or even to irrigate some of the farmland that is no longer fertile because of climate change, because of these rising temperatures. So there's some interest in, I guess at this point, most of it's in theory and not practice. But there was a German study that have looked at wrapping icebergs in plastic,
Uh,
and then
to,
coming
to
back
stop
to
the
them
melt.
like months later to check the water quality. Yeah.
Yeah, in my mind, as you were saying this, I was just imagining, this iceberg the size of an island, a big island, South Georgia, being towed by 20 boats north. But of course, you can only tow it so far, because the further north you tow, the warmer the temperatures and the quicker it melts.
Exactly, exactly. And the biggest thing that breaks up the icebergs is actually more the wave power. And you can imagine like the pressure on a big berg if you were tugging that with a boat it is gonna most likely start falling apart. So yeah, it's quite funny, isn't it, that this, especially that one material that's so taboo as well in this day, could be again used as one really useful source to actually help humanity and other places potentially. But I mean, it's, as I said, it's a huge job. Can you imagine, like trying to wrap an entire iceberg? I've just got visions of like this huge iceberg wrapped in cling film,
I
essentially.
just, I just, I just hope they don't use cling wrap like the stuff I have in my house, which never tears properly. It's
Yeah,
all the little teeth never work. So if they're
I
gonna do it, they need better technology for the teeth that tear it.
exactly, and I mean, God, like getting underneath an iceberg of like a large size as well. But
It
I mean,
seems a
like
little impractical to me. It seems a little impractical. I mean,
seemed far fetched, doesn't it? It's that sort of outside of our imagination that we would need to do this right now. But like I say, there's
yeah, I
already
mean,
been a study that's trialed it.
it seems like something out of a movie. Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. I'm going to watch with great interest to see what happens with this iceberg and see if it does run aground.
Like I said, I mean, I know I was sort of sat with a friend who's worked in the Antarctic areas, and he was sat showing me that they're basically looking at the wind, looking at the currents, and you can actually watch the satellite of where it is like there's so many scientists right now with eyes on it. So we should hopefully see more and more news articles coming out. Hopefully they're going to make it through all of the the other stuff that's in the media now.
Well, I think the world is calming down a little bit after the US elections are now behind us. So now we can go
Yeah,
back to talking about really fascinating. I mean, that was very important, but other fascinating things can make it into the news, and it won't just be filled with Brexit and US elections. Hopefully.
yeah, yeah. Some actual real time events happening as well, in terms of nature and conservation. It's going to be
Well,
interesting.
it is, and it's given me an urge. This story and talking to you about it prior to the podcast and today has also given me an urge to go to that part of the world, because I've never even been into South America, but I certainly have never been that far into the southern hemisphere. It would be
Yeah.
amazing to see. I've actually never seen penguins, which is,
Have you not?
believe it or not,
Well,
no, I
wow. I
haven't.
mean,
No.
I've never seen that so bad. I've never seen really like the cold ones, but I've definitely seen the little guys down in South Africa.
Yeah, for some
um,
reason I've always missed that. I mean, I go there all the time, and I've never seen them in South Africa. And I mean, they've got them in New Zealand as
Simon.
well, but I never saw them
Oh
in New
yeah, yeah,
Zealand.
yeah. You need to sort that out, Byron.
Well, well, one day when we can travel again more freely, it'll be on my list. Thank you so much for digging into this. It's really interesting. I will stick the link for your Instagram in the show notes so people can follow you, because I'm sure that you will be Instagramming about it as more information comes, and also a couple of the links to the news topics and some of the science reports and stuff that you referenced in this.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me again. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, as always, for listening. If you would like to support these podcasts, please head over to patreon.com/Byron Pace. And if you want to read about topics like we discuss in this show, then go over to the Modern Huntsman website and find my monthly column called Into the Anthropocene. The link for that is also in the show notes. We tackle everything from the unexpected consequences of trying to clean up plastics in our oceans and what that might do for certain floating organisms and ecosystems, but also the alleged human rights abuses that the WWF have been linked to. So you can read all about that on the Into the Anthropocene column on modernhuntsman.com.